There is a moment, captured in grainy black and white archive footage, when Dean Martin turns to the camera, raises his glass, and smiles that famous crooked smile. Millions of Americans watched that smile for decades. They believed they understood the man behind it. They were wrong. Nearly 100 years old now, Angie Dickinson recently broke a silence she had carried since 1995. Not about scandal. Not about romance. About something far more quiet, far more human, a truth she alone witnessed on the day the King of Cool finally set down his glass for the last time. What she revealed changes everything we thought we knew about Dean Martin. To understand why her words carry such weight, we have to go back to a dusty film set in 1958, where two young stars were about to create a bond that would outlast marriages, outlast Hollywood itself, and outlast Dean Martin's own life. Rio Bravo was supposed to be just another Western. Howard Hawks was directing. John Wayne was the headline star. But for Angie Dickinson, cast as the sharp-tongued gambler Feathers, and for Dean Martin, cast as a broken deputy fighting his way back to sobriety, this film became something else entirely. A turning point neither of them expected. Because here's the contrast almost no one talks about. On screen, Dean Martin played a man drowning in alcohol, desperate to reclaim his dignity. Off-screen, Dean Martin was quietly building a persona that the entire world would eventually mistake for reality. The character of Dude was fiction. But the mask he wore for the next 4 decades? That was the real performance. Angie Dickinson saw both sides. The actor and the man. And for over 60 years, she rarely spoke about what she witnessed. Until now. Before filming began, Dean Martin had already opened a restaurant on Sunset Boulevard, a gathering place where Hollywood's biggest names came to eat, drink, and be seen. Angie had crossed paths with him there. Polite nods. Passing conversations. Nothing more than acquaintances drifting through the same glittering circles. It wasn't until they spent weeks together on set, rehearsing lines, waiting between takes, and sharing meals in folding chairs under the desert sun that something shifted. A friendship began to form. One that neither of them could have predicted would last a lifetime, survive divorces, survive fame, and ultimately survive death itself. What Angie didn't know then was that she was about to become one of the only people alive who understood the difference between Dean Martin the entertainer and Dean Martin the man. And decades later, she would be the one to finally tell us the truth. That truth begins right here, tonight. Angie Dickinson often said something that surprised people who expected stories of jealousy or rivalry between Hollywood's biggest names. She said there was never a single moment of tension between them. Not during filming. Not after. Not once in over 3 decades of friendship. That alone made their relationship rare in an industry built on competition and ego. But it was one small habit that Angie returned to again and again in interviews, a detail so simple it almost seems insignificant, until you understand what it represented. Long after Rio Bravo wrapped, long after both of their careers had soared in different directions, Dean Martin never once called her by her real name and greeting. He called her Feathers. Every single time they crossed paths, at parties, at industry events, decades after the cameras stopped rolling, he would grin and say her character's name like it was an inside joke only the two of them understood. For Angie, it wasn't just charming. It was proof of something rare in Hollywood, loyalty that didn't fade once the spotlight moved elsewhere. Their bond extended beyond the two of them. Angie grew close with Jean Martin, Dean's second wife, a friendship that outlived Dean and Jean's own marriage. Two families, intertwined not by blood but by mutual respect that Hollywood rarely allows to survive this long. While that quiet friendship deepened behind the scenes, Dean Martin's public career was exploding into legend. Rio Bravo proved something critics doubted after his split from Jerry Lewis just years earlier, that Dean could stand entirely on his own, without a comedy partner, without a safety net. His performance as a broken man clawing back his self-respect silenced skeptics overnight. From there, his rise became unstoppable. He joined Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop to form the Rat Pack, a group whose Las Vegas performances became the stuff of American legend. In 1960, Ocean's 11 cemented their cultural dominance, a film so influential it would be remade decades later for a new generation. Then came television. The Dean Martin Show launched in 1965 and ran for nearly 10 years, becoming one of the most beloved variety programs in American history. And with it came the image. The glass in his hand. The lazy grin. The persona known across the country as the King of Cool. Audiences everywhere assumed what they saw was real, a man perpetually relaxed, perpetually intoxicated, and effortlessly charming because he simply didn't care. But according to those closest to him, that image was never the whole story. It was carefully built, deliberately maintained, and almost entirely misunderstood by the very audience who loved him for it. What Angie Dickinson eventually revealed about that glass would change the way an entire generation remembers Dean Martin. Here is where the story takes its most surprising turn, the detail Angie Dickinson has repeated most consistently over the years, the one that reshapes everything the public assumed about Dean Martin. That glass he held on stage, night after night, television appearance after television appearance, rarely contained what audiences believed. According to Angie, and later confirmed by Dean's own children, it was often filled with apple juice. Not vodka. Not scotch. Apple juice. The man millions of Americans believed was perpetually drunk was, in reality, performing sobriety's opposite as carefully choreographed entertainment. He understood exactly what audiences expected from him, and he gave it to them, night after night, decade after decade, while quietly living a far more disciplined life behind closed doors. Angie Dickinson was emphatic about this. Dean was never dependent on alcohol the way the public assumed. The image was a costume, not a confession. Why would a man build an entire persona around something so easily misunderstood? Perhaps because Dean Martin understood something most performers never grasp, that the audience doesn't always want the truth. Sometimes they want the myth. And Dean Martin was willing to carry that myth for 40 years, even as it followed him long after the cameras stopped rolling. Behind that carefully maintained image, though, was a private life far quieter than anyone suspected. Dean Martin married 3 times. First to Betty MacDonald in 1941, with whom he had 4 children. Then to Jean Beager in 1949, his longest marriage, lasting more than 2 decades and producing 3 more children. Finally, to Catherine Hahn in 1973, a marriage that ended after only a few years. 8 children in total, several of whom pursued their own careers in entertainment. Despite his demanding schedule, those who knew him insisted Dean made real efforts to stay present in his children's lives, something rarely mentioned in the flashy retellings of his Rat Pack years. Away from Las Vegas stages and television cameras, Dean's true passions were surprisingly simple. Golf consumed much of his free time, so much that many of his business relationships were built on the golf course rather than in nightclubs. He also raised Andalusian horses on his ranch, tending to them personally whenever his schedule allowed. This was the real Dean Martin. Not the man collapsing into a piano, drink in hand, that audiences adored on television. A quieter man. A private man. A father who understood the difference between performance and reality, even when the world refused to see it. But this quiet, carefully balanced life was about to be shattered by a tragedy so devastating that Dean Martin would never fully recover, one that would change not just his career but the very course of his remaining years. On March 21, 1987, Dean Martin received news that would break something inside him permanently. His son, Dean Paul Martin, had been killed when his military training aircraft crashed into the San Bernardino Mountains. He was only 35 years old. Dean Paul wasn't just Dean Martin's son. He was one of his greatest sources of pride. Before joining the California Air National Guard, he had performed as part of the music group Dino, Desi, and Billy, carrying his father's entertainment legacy into a new generation. His sudden death sent shockwaves through Hollywood, but for Dean Martin himself, it was something far more devastating than shock. It was the beginning of the end. Those closest to him say Dean was never quite the same afterward. The loss didn't just create emotional pain, it seemed to hollow something out of him entirely, accelerating a decline that had already been quietly building for years. Because behind the golf games and the Andalusian horses, another story had been unfolding, one involving decades of heavy smoking, a habit common throughout the entertainment industry of that era, but one that came with a devastating cost. The years of cigarettes had slowly been damaging his lungs long before anyone noticed the warning signs. By 1993, doctors at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center delivered news that confirmed what his declining energy had already suggested: lung cancer. Surgery was recommended. Dean Martin declined it. He made that decision quietly, deliberately, after weighing his own health and the risks involved. His family respected his choice, understanding this was a man who had always lived life on his own terms. From that point forward, the entertainer who once commanded stages in front of thousands of adoring fans in Las Vegas simply disappeared from public life. His appearances became almost non-existent. He retreated to his home in Beverly Hills, spending his final years in a stillness that stood in stark contrast to the roaring nightclubs and packed television studios that had defined his career. Friends who visited during this period described evenings spent quietly, dining alone, music playing softly in the background, and television flickering in an otherwise empty room. The man who once had an entire nation laughing alongside him now sat largely in solitude, worlds away from the character audiences believed defined him. This wasn't decline born of scandal or self-destruction. It was grief. It was disease. It was a private unraveling that the public, still enchanted by reruns of his television show and his hit records playing on the radio, never fully understood. And then, on December 25, 1995, in his Beverly Hills home, Dean Martin passed away. He was 78 years old. The official cause was acute respiratory failure caused by emphysema combined with lung cancer. Angie Dickinson was among those who said goodbye that day, and what she witnessed during his final hours reveals something about Dean Martin's true character that the public has waited 30 years to hear. His funeral was a private affair, attended only by family, close friends, and a handful of longtime colleagues who had witnessed his rise from a nightclub crooner to one of America's most beloved entertainers. Angie Dickinson was there that day, standing among the people who truly knew him, not the audience who only saw the persona. She later revealed a small, quiet detail from that day, one she has carried with her for nearly 3 decades. She rode in the family car alongside Johnny Carson during the funeral procession. 2 people who had spent careers standing beside Dean Martin's spotlight are now sitting together in silence, mourning the man behind it. Also present that day was Jean Martin, his second wife, the woman he had divorced more than 2 decades earlier. Despite the years and the separation, she remained by his side during his final hours, a testament to the respect that somehow survived even after their marriage had ended. It was one final, quiet confirmation of something Angie had always believed about Dean Martin, that whatever the cameras showed the world, the people who truly knew him remembered something entirely different, a man capable of inspiring lasting loyalty long after the spotlight faded. In interviews given as recently as 2023, Angie continued describing Dean the same way she always had. A darling man. Approachable. Naturally funny, without ever needing to force it. She insisted, again and again, that the drinking persona belonged to the stage and the television screen, never to the private, reserved man she came to know over decades of friendship. She has never once suggested romance between them. Never hinted at conflict. Every memory she offers circles back to the same singular truth, mutual respect that never wavered across more than 3 decades. Today, Angie Dickinson lives quietly in Beverly Hills, rarely appearing publicly, her health described as stable for her age. When she does speak, however briefly, about Dean Martin, classic Hollywood fans listen closely, because she remains one of the last living witnesses to the truth behind one of entertainment's most misunderstood icons. Dean Martin's estate, valued at roughly $30 million at the time of his death, now equivalent to nearly $65 million today, included his Beverly Hills home, his Palm Springs property, and decades of music royalties still managed carefully through family trusts. But perhaps his greatest legacy isn't measured in dollars or real estate. It's measured in the fact that Rio Bravo, the film that first brought him together with Angie Dickinson, has been carefully restored, allowing new generations to witness the performance that first proved Dean Martin was far more than a persona. In the end, what Angie Dickinson remembers isn't the glamour, isn't the fame, and isn't even the legendary status Dean Martin achieved. What she remembers is simpler and, somehow, more powerful, a kind, funny man who made everyone around him feel instantly at ease. Perhaps that's why, decades later, his name still lingers, not as a myth, but as a memory worth protecting.